to a summer edition of the teaching series. So if you had a chance to watch last week's teaching or to listen to it, you will know that we are not going to be in any kind of a mini-series throughout the rest of the summer. So we're going to be just doing some individual episodes, some shorter teachings that just kind of allow people as they're traveling and whatnot. For those of us who are in the States, I know many of you are watching this from around the world. It's not summer where you're at. Much love to you in your winter. But for us here in the United States, people are traveling a lot. And so we wanted to do a couple of shorter teachings that just allow families to engage the teaching series maybe a little bit more deeply during the summer while traveling. And just knowing that we've been putting a lot of time into these episodes, that wanted to offer you some really cool observations into the text and some things that are a lot of fun that are outside of any kind of particular series. So with that in mind, I know in last week's episode we were outside on my back porch, and today we are back in the studio in my home because there's a really cool video clip that I want to show you, but it's to help illustrate a proverb. So for many of you, the book of Proverbs, maybe for some of you, because there's 31 chapters, like you read a proverb a day. You read a chapter a day of all of these proverbs. And one of the things that we need to recognize about Proverbs is that it is wisdom literature. So I kind of grew up in a context where proverbs were promises. So it's like people would say, well, God promised this, and then they would quote Proverbs. And they don't recognize that Proverbs is a book of wisdom sayings. They're not promises. They're not guarantees. But what they are is very wise people who have kind of analyzed the world, have lived in the world when they wrote these proverbs, saying, this is generally how things go if you do this. And so it's not promises, but it's to say, no, this is what we've observed, and this is true most of the time. So, for example, let me show you one such proverb that has been significant to me, and it's a proverb you've probably heard before, and it's from Proverbs 22:6. And the proverb is this: train up a child in the way they should go, and when they are old, they will not depart from it. Right? You've probably heard this proverb before. It's quoted quite a bit. You know, it's often quoted, when parents, are doing something. In fact, I just saw an Instagram post yesterday of somebody I know wearing a Michigan hat, and then his son is wearing a Michigan hat, and somebody commented, and their response was, train up a child in the way they should go, right? And you finish it, and when they are old, they will not depart from it. They will always be a U of M fan, right? According to my buddy. And then you've got others, and you get this all the time. So I've quoted this lots and lots and lots of times, and you probably have as well in some context or another. So what exactly is this proverb all about? Train up a child in the way they should go, and when they are old, they will not depart from it. Well, the way that most people interpret it, which I believe is accurate, is the first level of understanding. Like, I actually think that this proverb is operating on two different levels. And the first level is train up a child in the way they should go, and when they are old, they will not depart from it. The way that this often gets translated is like you train a child how to live life according to God's rules and God's regulations, and they will find hope and joy and life and freedom in it, that they'll never want to depart from it. And I believe that at level one, that is exactly what's going on, because of how the book of Proverbs functions. So when you read through Proverbs, Proverbs is, again, wisdom literature talking about how do we maximize this life that God has given to us. And in the book of Proverbs, there is the way of the wise and there is the way of the fool. So it is the wise versus the fool. And really, there's only two paths. There's the path of the wise that is following God's path for life, and then there's the path of the fool that follows their way. They know what's best, and they disregard God's way and God's path. And so the idea behind this proverb is like train up a child early on, like help them to see who is God, that God believes in them, that God loves them, that God's rules and God's ways are actually to give us life and freedom and joy, not supposed to suffocate us. And we've explored that several times here in the teaching series. But I believe that there is also one more level to this proverb that we often miss by just kind of moving on to the next proverb and not recognizing that there's another facet that I think is actually extremely helpful in order to live out the first interpretation of this, in order to walk out God's path. So train up a child in the way they should go, and when they are old, they will not depart from it. Now, literally in the Hebrew, this is in the masculine, so it's train up a child in the way he should go, and when he is old, he will not depart from it. This is a translation that recognizes that it's not just about boys or men in the scripture. It is boys and girls, it is men and women. But literally this Hebrew, or this proverb is in Hebrew, train up a child in the way he should go. And you go, what does that mean? Like, what is that getting at? Well, let me show you this video clip now, because this is really talking about the way or the path a child is to take. And ultimately, yes, we want this child to go in the path of God, but there's another level to this that I believe helps us to empower a child to be able to walk out God's path for them in their life. And so here's the video clip. In the series we did on Psalm 23, we talked about paths of righteousness, and we talked about, how the sheep create these paths. And I showed a similar video, but this one is different. And so when you start to see here the landscape of where sheep and goats operate, you see all of these lines on the hills. We talked about this in connection to the paths of righteousness, and we said, well, what creates those lines? And you go, oh man, it's actually a flock. And then this is something that I love to do on my trip, is that after we have seen a flock, after we have seen the lines, I haven't actually pointed out the lines yet, is that I line my group up like this. So for those of you who are listening, I basically line them up in rows on a hill. And what I do is I say, okay, you come here, and they get on, one place, and then I align everybody. And so we've got about 5 or 6 rows of 6 to 7 people in each row. And then what I do is, what I'm doing here is I stand in the front. And what I do is I say, okay, everybody, now look down. And what are you standing on? And all of a sudden they recognize that they're standing on a path, because from above, like, you can see these lines really well, but at ground level, those lines are very, very, very subtle. And until somebody points out to you that you're standing on one of these paths, you don't even recognize it. And so they all stand on a particular path, and I stand in front, and I just simply ask the question, are you all following me if I am the shepherd and you are the sheep? And they go, yeah. And I said, exactly, because the lines that you are standing on are paths that sheep make when they are following the shepherd. But note that we can be on different lines, but we are also still following the shepherd. And friends, this is what I believe that this proverb is getting at, is that when we say train up a child in the way he should go, part of our responsibility, and I want to talk first and foremost about parents here, is that first and foremost, as a parent, yes, I want them to be going in a general direction, right, to follow the shepherd Jesus. That I want them to be moving on God's path and God's movement. But what I also need to recognize is that I need to try to figure out what is the unique path of my child for them to walk out what God is calling them to do. So that the second level is everybody has a unique path. Each of my children have a unique path. And on the one level, my wife and I are training them to understand God's will, God's way, God's path of life. What are God's instructions? Why do we follow Jesus? Like helping them to understand that from kind of a level 1 perspective. But the second level is that my wife and I recognize that each of my kids are different. We can't treat them the same way in all situations. Again, in some situations, right, that general level 1 is these instructions are for all 4 of them. But then there are specifics to how those instructions get played out that we need to look at the child we're talking to and going, okay, Denyon functions a certain way. Araya functions a certain way. Calyx functions a certain way. Xyler functions a certain way. And when we lay out specifics, we have to recognize that we can't treat any of our 2 kids the exact same way because they're different. They are unique. And that is precisely the picture going on here. That when we train up a child in the way he should go, or train up a child in the way they should go, part of a parent's goal is to try to discern, God, how have you made my child to function? How do they learn? What gifts have you given to them? How do I help them become true to the path that you have given them to walk under the umbrella, right, of God's rules and God's regulations and God's larger path of life? What is their specific path, God, that you are calling them to walk? And how do they learn? How do they understand? How are they motivated? How can I help them specifically according to who they are uniquely, that allows them to follow the larger path, which is ultimately walking after God? And so train up a child in the way he should go or she should go, and when they are old, they will not depart from it. Of course they won't depart from it. Or again, this is wisdom literature. This is not a guarantee. But in general speaking terms, if you have helped your child become the best version of themselves, unique to who they are, then they're not going to want to be someone else. That so often as parents, we kind of just say, well, no, our kids are going to become this. And we've predetermined a path that we want them to walk, and we force them to try to walk in this path. And it's like they revolt from that path because we're trying to make them something they're not to conform to something we want them to be. But ultimately, if we can stand back and say, okay, level 1 is following Jesus, right? Following God's path. But to then go the next layer deeper and go, okay, so how do I help them become who God has uniquely gifted them to be? Friends, everyone has a unique path. And we need to try to do our best to draw that out, to discern that, and to encourage our kids to walk that, to be true to who God has called them to be. And so that's from a parenting perspective. But for those of you who are part of a business or an organization, like you've already made this jump, I'm guessing, right? That ultimately there's a certain direction that a company is going, or certain direction an organization is going. And you actually probably have a code of conduct. That's like level 1. Like there's a certain path we're all going to walk as employees of this particular business or organization. But if you lead a team in any way, you know that you can't treat 2, of your team members the same, and yet we do it every day. Why? Because it's easier that way. Like when we have to sit back and go, okay, who is this individual? What have they been uniquely gifted to do? Do I have them in the right spot? Am I encouraging them? Do I know what their aspirations are, what their goals are as their team leader or as their employer or as their manager? Am I helping them go further and faster down their journey? Or am I just kind of treating everybody the same and not taking everyone's unique path into consideration as a leader? Because the best leaders mobilize who they have, and in order to understand what they have, they need to get to know the individual, what their gift set is, to be checking in to go, are you doing the things that give you life? Are you enjoying what you are doing? How can I help you? And as a leader, you're trying to find ways to maximize that individual, not to get the most production out of them. That's not primary. It's that you want that team member to love what they do. And if they love what they do better work, they're a better teammate. You as a company or organization go down further and faster if people are in the right spots, loving what they do. And in so many ways, as a leader, that starts with you. Are you recognizing that everyone has a unique path, and are you helping them to accomplish that? So friends, there you go. We can think about this in terms of parenting. We can think about this in terms of leadership. You can also just think in terms of this, of just how you engage your friends. And from a various perspective is to go, okay, how do I treat my friends, my family, my coworkers, those I get to do life with, from the perspective that everyone has a unique path and that we ultimately want everybody following in the way of Jesus. But then how do I help everyone that I'm responsible for become the best versions of themselves, to be true to the identity that God has created them to be, in order for them to walk out the path that is uniquely theirs. So friends, thanks for watching. Thanks for listening. May you have a great rest of your week, and may you walk out the text well in your life.